The morning light filtered through the kitchen curtains just like it had every day for the past year and a half. I sat at our small breakfast table, my arthritic fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 73, I'd grown accustomed to the silence, but some mornings it still caught me off guard. The absence of Harold's newspaper rustling, the missing sound of his work boots on the linoleum, the empty chair across from me that still held the indentation of his body after all this time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. My name is Dorothy Chen, and for 52 years I believed I knew everything there was to know about my husband. Harold was a man of routines. Up at 6 a.m., coffee black, toast with marmalade, 20 minutes reading the local paper before heading out to his garage workshop by 7:30 sharp. He was a retired postal worker who'd spent his golden years tinkering with small engines, fixing lawnmowers for neighbors, and building birdhouses that lined our backyard fence like tiny sentries. We'd lived simply in our little ranch house on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names, where children still rode bicycles without helmets down tree-lined streets, and where the biggest excitement was usually the annual 4th of July block party that Harold insisted on organizing every single year. Our house was modest, a 1,200 square foot ranch with cream-colored siding that Harold repainted every 5 years like clockwork, whether it needed it or not. The front porch had 2 rocking chairs that we'd bought at a yard sale 30 years ago, where we'd spend summer evenings watching fireflies dance across our small front lawn. No children of our own. That particular dream had slipped away from us quietly over the years, one negative pregnancy test at a time, until we simply stopped talking about it altogether. But we'd found contentment in our routines, our shared meals, our evening walks around the neighborhood, where Harold would tip his cap to every person we passed. He knew Mrs. Patterson's arthritis was acting up before she did, remembered that young Tommy Morrison was struggling with his math homework, and somehow always appeared at the Johnsons' front door with his toolbox whenever their ancient furnace started making that concerning rattling sound. Harold was born and raised right here in Cedar Falls, the son of a railroad conductor and a seamstress who'd immigrated from China in the 1920s. His father, Wei Ming Chen, had worked the Illinois Central Railroad for 43 years without missing a single day, and Harold inherited that same unwavering work ethic. After high school, Harold joined the Postal Service straight away, not because he had grand dreams of career advancement, but because he genuinely believed that delivering mail was about connecting people to the ones they loved. He'd tell me stories about elderly folks who waited by their mailboxes for letters from distant children, about the joy on a young mother's face when she received photos of her new grandchild, about how a simple birthday card could brighten someone's entire week. Dorothy, he'd tell me, settling into his worn leather recliner each evening after his route, the smallest kindness can change someone's whole day. Sometimes it can change their whole life. That was Harold. Steady, dependable, kind to his core, with an almost mystical ability to sense when someone needed help before they even knew they needed it themselves. We'd met at the Cedar Falls Public Library in 1971. I was 21, fresh out of nursing school, trying to find a quiet corner to study for my state board exams. Harold was 23, already 3 years into his postal career, sitting at a corner table with a stack of books about woodworking and a thermos of coffee that smelled like it had been brewing since dawn. He was quietly turning pages, completely absorbed in his reading, when I accidentally knocked over my coffee cup trying to reach for a reference book on the shelf above our shared table. Coffee went everywhere, across my nursing notes, his woodworking books, and somehow managed to splash onto his crisp white shirt. I was mortified, apologizing profusely, while dabbing at the mess with the inadequate napkins from my purse. But Harold just laughed, not at me, but with genuine amusement at the situation, and said, "Well, I guess my shirt needed washing anyway. But your notes look like they're in real trouble. Can I help you rewrite any of that?" We spent the next 4 hours reconstructing my study materials, with Harold asking thoughtful questions about nursing procedures, and me explaining the intricacies of patient care. By the time the library closed at 9, I realized I'd learned more in those 4 hours of conversation than I had in weeks of solitary studying. Harold had a way of listening, really listening, that made you feel like the most interesting person in the world. He asked me to dinner the following Friday. Then dinner the Friday after that. By Christmas, I knew I was going to marry this gentle man who remembered the names of every librarian, who helped elderly patrons find books they couldn't reach, and who somehow made the simple act of walking through town feel like an adventure. We were married on a beautiful spring morning in May 1972 at the small Methodist church where Harold's family had attended for 3 generations. Nothing fancy, just immediate family, a few close friends, and Harold's elderly mail route customers who insisted they wouldn't miss his special day for anything in the world. Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, who was 92 at the time and had been receiving mail from Harold for 8 years, somehow managed to attend in her best Sunday dress and pressed a $20 bill into my hand afterward. "That boy," she whispered conspiratorially. "That boy has been checking on me every single day for years. You're getting a treasure, dear." She was right. Harold was a treasure. In our early years of marriage, when I was working long shifts at Cedar Falls General Hospital, and Harold was walking his mail route 6 days a week, we'd still find time for each other. He'd leave little notes in my lunch bag, not love letters exactly, but small observations about our life together. "Noticed the daffodils are coming up in the backyard. Spring's coming, Dot, your favorite season." Or, "Mrs. Patterson asked about you today. Said you look like someone who knows how to heal people from the inside out. She's right." Harold had started woodworking as a hobby shortly after we married, initially just to build practical things for our house. Shelves, a kitchen table, a hope chest that still sat at the foot of our bed. But over the years, his projects became more elaborate. The birdhouses started as a simple weekend project, but evolved into intricate, miniature architectural marvels. Each one was unique. Tiny Victorian houses with gingerbread trim, log cabin-style structures with impossibly small shingles, even a few that looked like miniature churches, complete with tiny steeples. He'd spend hours in his garage workshop, carefully measuring, cutting, sanding, and painting each piece. Our backyard became a showcase of Harold's craftsmanship. 23 birdhouses lined our fence, each one occupied by different bird families throughout the seasons. Harold could identify every species that visited our yard: cardinals, blue jays, finches, chickadees, woodpeckers, and he'd adjusted each house's entrance hole to accommodate its intended residents. He kept detailed notes about which houses were occupied when, tracking migration patterns and nesting behaviors with the same methodical attention he'd applied to his mail route. But the garage itself, that had always been Harold's private domain. It wasn't that he'd forbidden me from entering. It was more subtle than that. Whenever I'd suggest organizing it or cleaning it, he'd gently deflect. "Oh, Dot, it's such a mess in there. Nothing you'd be interested in. Just tools and sawdust and half-finished projects." When I'd offer to help with his woodworking, he'd smile and say, "You've got enough on your hands with work, sweetheart. This is my way of unwinding. My meditation time." Over the decades, I'd respected that boundary. Marriage, I'd learned, required allowing each other space to breathe, space to have something that was entirely your own. Harold never questioned my Tuesday evening book club meetings or my weekend gardening sessions where I'd spend hours alone with my thoughts and my flowers. In return, I never pressed about his garage time. Now, sitting in our quiet kitchen on this particular October morning, I could see the garage through our window. It was a detached 2-car structure that Harold had built himself shortly after we'd bought the house in 1974. He'd spent 3 months of weekends constructing it, carefully laying the foundation, framing the walls, installing electrical wiring with the help of his friend Jim Morrison from down the street. The garage had 2 main areas, one side for parking our car, and the other side that had been designated as Harold's workshop from day one. The workshop side had windows along the back wall that Harold had installed to provide natural light for his projects. I could see those windows from our kitchen table, but they were positioned too high and at the wrong angle for me to ever glimpse what was happening inside. For 50 years, those windows had glowed with warm yellow light every evening after dinner as Harold pursued his woodworking hobby. For the past 18 months, those windows had remained dark. Harold had suffered his heart attack on a Tuesday morning in March of last year. One moment he was reading the newspaper, commenting on a story about the high school's new baseball field, and the next moment he was slumped forward in his chair, the paper still clutched in his hands. The paramedics said it was massive and instantaneous. He hadn't suffered, they assured me. But I suffered. Oh, how I suffered. The funeral was everything Harold would have wanted. Simple, heartfelt, and attended by what seemed like half of Cedar Falls. His mail route customers came in droves, many of them elderly folks who'd known Harold for decades. They shared stories I'd never heard before. Mrs. Patterson talked about how Harold had noticed her mail piling up one winter and had used his spare key, the one she'd given him years earlier, to check on her, only to find her fallen in her hallway with a broken hip. He'd called the ambulance and stayed with her until her daughter arrived from Des Moines. Young Tommy Morrison, now a grown man with children of his own, told everyone about how Harold had spent countless evenings helping him with homework on our front porch, never accepting payment, but always accepting Tommy's mother's offer of fresh cookies. Sarah Johnson shared how Harold had quietly paid for their heating bill one particularly harsh winter when her husband was out of work, and how they'd only discovered this kindness years later when they'd tried to make payment arrangements with the utility company. Story after story, kindness after kindness. I sat in the front pew of that Methodist church, surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by my husband's gentle heart, and realized that Harold had been living a life of service, far more extensive than I'd ever imagined. Not a secret life exactly, but a quiet ministry of small acts that he'd never felt the need to discuss at home. In the months following the funeral, I'd gradually settled into my new routine as a widow. Friends and neighbors had been wonderfully supportive, bringing casseroles, offering to help with yard work, including me in their social activities. I'd learned to cook for one person, learned to sleep alone in our double bed, learned to fill the long evening hours with television programs and library books. But I'd avoided the garage entirely. It wasn't a conscious decision initially. In the first few weeks after Harold's death, I'd simply been too overwhelmed with funeral arrangements, insurance paperwork, and the general business of learning how to live alone. Then, as weeks turned to months, the garage became a sort of monument to my grief, a place too sacred and too painful to disturb. Harold's car was still parked in there, a 1998 Honda Civic, with only 47,000 miles on it, because Harold had always believed in taking care of his things. His workshop area remained exactly as he'd left it that Tuesday morning. Tools neatly arranged on his pegboard, his workbench cleared except for a half-finished birdhouse that would never be completed. Several times over the past 18 months, I'd walk to the garage door with the intention of going inside. I'd stand there with Harold's keys in my hand, keys that now lived in a small ceramic bowl by our front door, and try to summon the courage to turn the lock. But each time, I'd find myself overwhelmed by the finality of it all. Opening that door felt like admitting that Harold was truly gone, like crossing a threshold into a version of our life where his presence would be replaced by the physical artifacts of his absence. My friend Margaret Kowalski, who lived 3 houses down and had been widowed herself 4 years earlier, had gently suggested multiple times that I should deal with Harold's things when I felt ready. "It's not about forgetting him, Dorothy," she'd say during our weekly coffee visits. "It's about honoring his memory by taking care of what he left behind." Margaret was probably right. She usually was about practical matters. But there was something about that garage that felt different from Harold's clothes, which I'd donated to charity 6 months after his death, or his books, which I'd given to the library, or even his tools from around the house, which I'd offered to Jim Morrison's teenage grandson who was interested in learning carpentry. The garage felt like Harold's secret place, and I wasn't sure I had the right to enter it, but this particular October morning felt different. Maybe it was the changing season. Harold had always loved autumn, the way the maple trees in our yard turned brilliant shades of red and gold. Maybe it was the letter I'd received yesterday from Harold's life insurance company, officially closing his policy and marking some administrative end to his earthly affairs. Or maybe it was simply time. I finished my cold coffee, rinsed the cup in our small kitchen sink, and looked at myself in the reflection of the window above the basin. At 73, I looked older than I felt. My hair had gone completely gray, which I'd stopped coloring after Harold died. Not out of grief, but out of a sudden desire to stop pretending I was younger than I was. My face showed the lines of 73 years of living, but my eyes still looked alert, still looked curious. Harold used to say I had investigative eyes, the eyes of someone who noticed details, who cared about understanding the whole story. That's what makes you such a good nurse, Dot, he'd tell me. You don't just treat symptoms, you pay attention to the whole person. Maybe it was time to pay attention to the whole Harold. I walked to our front door and picked up his keys from the ceramic bowl. They felt heavier than I remembered, not physically, but emotionally. These keys had been Harold's daily companions for decades. The house key he'd used every evening when he returned from his mail route. The car key he'd used for trips to the hardware store, the grocery store, the occasional dinner out at Murphy's Diner on Friday nights, and the garage key, worn smooth from 50 years of daily use. I stepped outside into the crisp October air. Our yard looked good. Margaret's teenage grandson had been mowing the lawn all summer, and I'd kept up with Harold's flower beds out of habit more than passion. The 23 birdhouses along our fence were still occupied. I'd continued filling the bird feeders every few days, partly because I enjoyed watching the birds, but mostly because abandoning Harold's backyard wildlife felt like a betrayal. As I walked toward the garage, I noticed things I'd somehow missed during my 18 months of avoidance. The door needed painting. The white finish was starting to peel near the bottom where decades of Iowa weather had taken their toll. One of the small windows had a crack in it that had been repaired with clear tape, probably Harold's temporary fix that had become permanent. The concrete pad in front of the door had a small crack running diagonally across it, with a stubborn dandelion growing directly through the fissure. These small signs of normal wear and tear somehow made the garage feel less intimidating. It wasn't a monument or a shrine. It was just a building where Harold had spent time, a building that needed the same kind of maintenance attention Harold had always provided to everything in our life together. I reached the door and stood there for a moment, keys in my hand, watching my breath form small clouds in the cool morning air. Through the small window in the door, I could see shadowy shapes, Harold's workbench, the outlines of tools, what looked like stacks of lumber, normal garage things, normal workshop things, my D-shape. So why was my heart beating so fast? My D-shape. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism was stiff from 18 months of disuse, but it turned. I heard the familiar click that Harold had heard thousands of times before. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Not unpleasant, but distinctly Harold. Sawdust and wood stain, the faint scent of WD-40, and something else I couldn't immediately identify. Something sweet and warm that reminded me of Christmas morning. Full. I reached for the light switch, located exactly where logic suggested it would be, just inside the doorframe. The fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating Harold's workshop for the first time since his death. And that's when I realized that everything I thought I knew about my husband of 52 years had been wrong. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined as I stood there in the doorway, my eyes adjusting to the light and my brain struggling to process what I was seeing, was that Harold's greatest secret wasn't just hidden in that garage. It was a secret so profound, so impossibly beautiful, that it would shatter everything I thought I knew about the man I'd loved for over half a century. And it would prove that sometimes, the people we think we know best are actually angels walking among us in disguise. The workshop wasn't what I expected. Not at all. I had imagined Harold's space would be like most men's garages. Cluttered, dusty, filled with the accumulated detritus of decades of small projects and good intentions. Tools scattered across workbenches, coffee cans full of bent nails and stripped screws, towers of warped lumber that might someday become something useful. That's what I'd seen in neighbors' garages, what I'd observed during the few times Harold had invited Jim Morrison or other friends over to help with larger projects. But Harold's workshop was immaculate. More than immaculate, it was organized with the precision of a surgical suite. Every tool had its designated place on the pegboard wall, outlined in black markers so that its absence would be immediately obvious. His workbench, a massive oak structure that Harold had built himself in the early 1980s, was cleared except for that one unfinished birdhouse and a small notebook lying open beside it. The floors were swept clean. The windows, despite being on the backside of the garage where I rarely saw them, were spotless. Even the light bulbs overhead appeared to have been recently cleaned, casting bright, even illumination across the entire space without a speck of dust to dim their output. But it wasn't the cleanliness that made me stop breathing. It wasn't the organization that made my knees weak. It was what I saw along the far wall of the workshop, displayed like artwork in a gallery. Photographs, hundreds of them. They were arranged in neat rows, each one carefully mounted and labeled, creating a massive collage that covered nearly the entire back wall of the garage. From where I stood in the doorway, I could see they were all different sizes. Some were wallet-sized snapshots, others were larger prints, and a few appeared to be professional portraits in elegant frames. But from this distance, I couldn't make out the details or understand what I was looking at. I took my first tentative steps into Harold's sanctuary, my footsteps echoing slightly in the spacious room. As I moved closer to the photograph wall, details began to emerge, and my confusion deepened. These weren't family photos. Harold and I didn't have children, and we had very few living relatives. His parents had passed away in the 1990s, and my only sister lived in California. We exchanged Christmas cards and birthday calls, but we weren't the type of family that generated walls full of photographic memories. These weren't photos of our life together either. I would have recognized pictures of our wedding, our vacations, our anniversaries. I would have known if Harold had been secretly documenting our daily life for some romantic surprise. As I got closer, I began to realize that I didn't recognize a single person in any of these photographs. The first photo I examined closely was an 8x10 color print of a young woman in a graduation cap and gown, beaming at the camera with the kind of joy that comes from achieving something difficult and meaningful. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed familiar, though I was certain I'd never met her. At the bottom of the photo was a small white label in Harold's careful handwriting. Jennifer Martinez, RN, May 15, 2018. Cedar Falls Community College. First in her family to graduate college. Next to that was a smaller photo of what looked like a family gathering. Parents, grandparents, and several children around a dinner table, all smiling at the camera. The label read, Thompson Family Reunion, July 4, 2019. First time in 12 years, all siblings together. I moved along the wall, examining photo after photo, reading label after label, and slowly beginning to understand that I was looking at a collection of other people's most precious moments. Graduations, weddings, family reunions, birthday parties, anniversary celebrations, new babies, new homes. Dozens and dozens of families, all strangers to me, all documented with the care and attention usually reserved for one's own relatives. But how did Harold have these photos? And why? Some of the pictures were clearly professional portraits, the kind you'd get from a photography studio for annual family pictures or special occasions. Others looked like snapshots that someone had taken at informal gatherings. A few appeared to be newspaper clippings, engagement announcements, and wedding photos from the Cedar Falls Gazette's social pages. As I continued studying the wall, I began to notice patterns. Many of the photos were grouped together by family, with labels that tracked their stories across multiple years. Here was the Rodriguez family, Maria's high school graduation in 2015, her wedding in 2017, the birth of her first child in 2019, and what appeared to be a family portrait from just last year showing Maria, her husband, and their toddler son in their new home. The Patterson family had an entire section, elderly Mrs. Patterson, whom I recognized as one of Harold's mail route customers, surrounded by what must have been her children and grandchildren, at various gatherings spanning at least a decade. There was Mrs. Patterson's 80th birthday party, her 85th, what looked like a family Christmas morning, and several photos of her with different combinations of family members visiting her over the years. The Morrison family, our neighbors Jim and Susan and their children, had their own collection. I saw photos of their son Tommy at various ages, including his high school graduation, his wedding 3 years ago, and recent photos of him with his own young children. There were pictures of their daughter Sarah's college graduation, her wedding, her promotion ceremony at the bank where she worked in downtown Cedar Falls. But these weren't photos that Harold should have had access to. These were intimate family moments, personal celebrations, private gatherings. How had my husband acquired pictures from inside these families' most precious occasions? Muscle. I moved toward Harold's workbench, hoping his notebook might provide some explanation. It was open to a page dated just 2 weeks before his death, filled with Harold's careful script. March 3rd. Received wedding photos from Jennifer Martinez, now Jennifer Martinez Williams. Beautiful ceremony. Her parents looked so proud. 27 years old. Married to a good man. Just finished her nursing degree. Remember when she was 12 and her father was out of work. Long way from those days. Sent congratulations card and $50 gift certificate to Williams Sonoma. Address: 412 Elm Street, Apt 3B. I flipped back through the pages, reading entry after entry that made no sense. February 28th, Tommy Morrison Jr.'s second birthday party. Invited but couldn't attend due to Dorothy's book club. Sent stuffed elephant and card. His grandmother, my Mrs. Patterson, was there. 4 generations in one photo. Beautiful. February 15th. Sarah Johnson Miller's promotion to assistant branch manager at First National. Worked so hard for this. Remember helping her with math homework on our porch 20 years ago? Sent congratulations flowers to her office. January 20th, Rodriguez family moved into their new home on Oak Street. 3 bedrooms, big backyard for little Miguel. Maria cried when they got the keys. Sent housewarming gift, toolkit for Carlos, and plant for Maria. Page after page, entry after entry, all documenting Harold's intimate knowledge of and involvement in the lives of dozens of families throughout Cedar Falls. But this wasn't the casual awareness that comes from living in a small town for decades. This was detailed, ongoing investment in the major life events of people who, as far as I knew, were casual acquaintances at most. I turned more pages, going further back in time, and the entries stretched on for years. Harold had been keeping this record for at least a decade, possibly longer. And as I read, a pattern began to emerge that made my chest tighten with a mixture of awe and confusion. Harold hadn't just been observing these families' milestones. He'd been quietly participating in them. December 12, 2018. Martinez family struggling with Jennifer's college tuition for her final semester. Father's hours cut at the plant. Arranged anonymous scholarship through Cedar Falls Community Foundation. $2,500. She'll never know where it came from, but she'll graduate in May. September 3, 2017. Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter starting kindergarten. Single mother, working 2 jobs, can't afford school supplies. Delivered bag of supplies to school office marked anonymous donation for Emma Patterson. June 15, 2016, Thompson family reunion planned for July 4th. 3 siblings can't afford travel expenses to Cedar Falls. Arranged, quote, contest winner travel vouchers through Jim Morrison's cousin at the bus station. All siblings will be there for first time in over a decade. My hands were shaking as I continued reading. Each entry revealed another secret kindness, another anonymous intervention in someone's life, another instance of Harold quietly orchestrating small miracles for people who had no idea their mail carrier was serving as their guardian angel. But how? How had Harold managed all of this without my knowledge? We shared our finances. I balanced our checkbook every month. I would have noticed large or unusual expenditures. I would have seen charitable donations on our tax returns. I would have known if Harold was giving away significant amounts of money. I walked over to a filing cabinet that sat beneath Harold's workbench. It was unlocked. Inside, I found folders organized alphabetically by family name, each one containing what appeared to be comprehensive records. The Martinez file contained copies of scholarship applications, correspondence with the Cedar Falls Community Foundation, bank records showing payments made from an account I'd never heard of, and detailed notes about Jennifer's academic progress and career goals. The Patterson file contained information about Mrs. Patterson's financial situation, copies of utility bills that Harold had apparently been helping to pay, records of grocery deliveries, and notes about her family members and their visits. There were also what appeared to be medical records, not Mrs. Patterson's private records, but notes Harold had made about her health concerns, doctor's appointments, and medications, all information that would have been shared naturally during their daily interactions when he delivered her mail. As I examined file after file, I began to understand the scope of what Harold had been doing. He'd been using his position as a mail carrier, his daily access to the most intimate details of people's lives, to identify families in need, and then systematically providing help while maintaining complete anonymity. But where had he gotten the money for all of this assistance? Our Postal Service pension and Social Security provided comfortable but not extravagant retirement income. We'd been careful savers throughout our marriage, but our savings account contained exactly what I expected it to contain. Enough for emergency expenses and modest end-of-life care, but nothing approaching the amounts Harold appeared to have been giving away. I opened another filing cabinet drawer and found my answer. Harold had been woodworking for money, not just building birdhouses for our backyard, but creating custom furniture, decorative items, and special commissions for clients throughout Iowa and beyond. The files contained records of sales dating back more than 15 years, with detailed accounting of materials costs, time invested, and profits earned. But these weren't the casual weekend projects I'd always assumed Harold was working on in his garage. These were sophisticated, professional quality pieces commanding significant prices. A custom dining room set sold for $3,200. A hand-carved hope chest brought $800. A series of children's furniture, beds, dressers, toy boxes, had earned more than $5,000 from a single customer in Des Moines. Harold had been running a legitimate woodworking business out of our garage, and I'd had no idea. I found order forms, correspondence with customers, shipping records, and tax documents that Harold had apparently been filing separately from our joint returns. Everything was legal and properly documented, but it had been completely separate from our shared financial life. Harold had been earning thousands of dollars each year from his hobby, and instead of spending that money on luxuries for us, he'd been systematically giving it away to families in need throughout our community. I slumped into Harold's workshop chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was discovering. My husband of 52 years had been living a double life, not a life of deception or betrayal, but a life of service so profound and so secret that I was only now beginning to understand its scope. But there was more. As I sat in Harold's chair, I noticed something I'd missed before. In the corner of the workshop, partially hidden behind a stack of lumber, was another filing cabinet. This one was locked. I found the key in Harold's desk drawer, labeled simply, "Personal." When I opened the locked cabinet, I found something that made me understand that everything I'd discovered so far was just the beginning. Inside were hundreds of letters, thank you notes, Christmas cards, graduation announcements, wedding invitations, birth announcements, all addressed to Harold, all from people whose names I recognized from the photo wall and the files. But they weren't addressed to Harold Chen, our last name. They were addressed to Harold Sterling, Megsa, Hode, Chode, Hood, Harold Sterling, a name I'd never heard before. I opened one of the letters, postmarked just 6 months ago. Dear Mr. Sterling, you probably don't remember me, but I'm Jennifer Martinez Williams now. I was Jennifer Martinez when I was struggling to finish nursing school 3 years ago. I never found out who provided the scholarship that allowed me to complete my degree, but I always suspected it might have been you. You were the one person who always seemed to believe in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. I wanted you to know that I've been accepted into the nurse practitioner program at the University of Iowa. I'll be specializing in family medicine, working with underserved communities. I keep thinking about how you used to tell me that one person's kindness could change someone's whole life. You were right. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to tell you that you changed mine. With endless gratitude. Jennifer Martinez Williams, RN. I opened another letter. Mr. Sterling. My grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, passed away peacefully last month. At 96, she lived a full and beautiful life, especially in her final years when so many family members were able to visit her regularly. At the funeral, we discovered that someone had been quietly helping with her expenses for over a decade. Utility bills, grocery deliveries, even some medical costs. The lawyer handling her estate said the payments all came from someone identified only as H. Sterling through the Cedar Falls Community Foundation. I don't know if you're the H. Sterling who helped our grandmother, but if you are, I want you to know that your kindness meant everything to our family. Grandma never had to worry about staying warm in winter or having enough food. Because of that, she could focus on enjoying her relationships with all of us instead of stressing about money. Our family will never forget this gift. Sincerely, the Patterson family. Letter after letter, story after story, all thanking Harold Sterling for kindnesses large and small. Anonymous scholarships, paid utility bills, mysterious gift certificates that appeared at exactly the right moments, contest prizes that solved transportation problems, donation programs that provided school supplies, and Christmas presents for children whose parents were struggling. Harold had created an entire alternate identity, Harold Sterling, through which he could provide help while maintaining his anonymity. And somehow, he'd managed to do all of this while living with me, sharing meals with me, sleeping beside me every night for decades, without my ever suspecting the scope of his secret ministry. But how had he managed the practical aspects? How had he maintained a separate identity, a separate banking system, a separate correspondence, all while living the routine life of a retired postal worker that I thought I knew so well? I found part of the answer in another file marked Operations. Harold had established his alternate identity shortly after he retired from the Postal Service 15 years ago. Using his middle name, Sterling, and our address, he'd opened a separate bank account, obtained a separate post office box for correspondence, and even filed separate tax returns for his woodworking income under the name Harold Sterling. All perfectly legal, all properly documented, but all completely separate from our shared life. Harold had been methodical and careful, creating systems that allowed him to help others while protecting both his anonymity and our marriage from any complications his charitable activities might create. But the most remarkable discovery was yet to come. In the very back of the locked filing cabinet, I found a leather-bound journal that appeared to contain Harold's personal reflections on his secret work. The entries weren't just records of financial transactions or family milestones. They were intimate thoughts about the philosophy and motivation behind what he'd been doing. The first entry was dated 15 years ago, shortly after Harold's retirement. March 15th, my last day as a mail carrier. 43 years of connecting people to the ones they love, of being trusted with their most important communications, of watching families grow and struggle and celebrate from the unique perspective of someone who visits every home every day. Dorothy thinks I'm ready to relax, to take up woodworking as a hobby, to enjoy the peaceful retirement we've both earned. And I will enjoy it. But I can't shake the feeling that my real work is just beginning. All these years I've seen things. I've noticed patterns. I've watched families struggle with challenges that could be easily solved if they just had a little help at the right moment. I've seen potential that never gets realized because of financial obstacles. I've witnessed love that gets strained by circumstances beyond anyone's control. What if I could do something about that? What if I could use the skills I've developed, the knowledge I've gained, the modest financial resources I could generate, to quietly make a difference in specific, targeted ways? I've been thinking about Mrs. Patterson lately, 82 years old, living alone, too proud to ask for help, but clearly struggling to make ends meet. Her children visit when they can, but they have their own families, their own financial pressures. She shouldn't have to choose between heating her house and buying groceries. Jennifer Martinez is 17, brilliant, dreams of becoming a nurse, but her family doesn't have money for college. Her father works hard, but his job at the plant is unpredictable. She could change so many lives as a nurse, but she might never get the chance. The Morrison boy, Tommy, is struggling in school, but his parents work such long hours they can't provide the help he needs. A few hours of tutoring each week could change his entire academic trajectory. Small interventions. Strategic kindness. Is strategic kindness anonymous assistance that preserves dignity while providing essential support? Dorothy doesn't need to know about this. She has her own life, her own interests, her own ways of contributing to our community. This could be my retirement project, my way of using the freedom that comes with not working full-time to make a real difference in the lives of people I've come to care about over the decades. I think I'll call myself Harold Sterling. Sterling, like silver, precious but not ostentatious. Harold Sterling can be the person who helps without needing recognition, who gives without needing thanks, who solves problems without needing credit. Dorothy will know Harold Chen, the retired postal worker who builds birdhouses and takes care of our home. Harold Sterling will be someone else entirely. Someone who helps families realize their dreams. I sat in Harold's workshop, surrounded by the evidence of his secret life, reading about the moment my husband had decided to become two people. Not out of deception, but out of love. Not to hide something shameful, but to protect something beautiful. As I continued reading through Harold's journal, I began to understand that what I'd discovered wasn't just evidence of my husband's charitable activities. It was a record of a man who had spent the last 15 years of his life systematically changing the trajectory of dozens of families while maintaining complete anonymity and humility. Harold had been an angel. A literal guardian angel, walking among us, using his modest resources and his deep knowledge of our community to provide exactly the right help at exactly the right moment to people who needed it most. And somehow, impossibly, he'd managed to do all of this while never letting me see anything other than the gentle, simple man I'd married 52 years ago. But as I closed Harold's journal and looked around his workshop one more time, I realized that my discoveries were far from over. Because tucked away in the corner, behind the filing cabinets and the photo wall, was a door I hadn't noticed before. A door that led to what appeared to be another room, another space within Harold's workshop that I hadn't yet explored. And if the past hour had taught me anything, it was that Harold's secrets had secrets of their own. The door was painted the same white as the garage walls, which explained why I hadn't noticed it immediately. It had no handle, just a small keyhole and what appeared to be a push-plate mechanism. I might have mistaken it for a utility panel or electrical access, if not for the fact that it was clearly designed to open into another space. I tried the push-plate first, but the door was locked. Looking back at Harold's keyring, I found a small silver key I hadn't used yet. It slid into the lock easily, and I heard the familiar click of tumblers aligning. When I pushed the door open, I was greeted by darkness and the scent of something I couldn't immediately identify. Something clean and medical, like the supply rooms at the hospital where I'd worked for so many years. I felt along the wall for a light switch and found it just inside the doorframe. When the lights came on, I had to grip the doorframe to steady myself. It was a medical clinic, not a makeshift first aid station or a hobbyist's collection of medical supplies. This was a fully equipped, professional-grade medical examination room that would have been appropriate in any doctor's office. There was an examination table with stirrups and adjustable height mechanisms, a rolling stool, a sink with hands-free faucets, cabinets filled with medical supplies, and equipment I recognized from my decades of nursing. Blood pressure monitors, stethoscopes, otoscopes, ophthalmoscopes, even a small autoclave for sterilizing instruments. But this wasn't just any medical examination room. As I stepped inside and began to examine the setup more closely, I realized it was specifically designed for women's healthcare. The stirrups on the examination table, the speculum sets in the supply drawers, the pamphlets in a wall-mounted rack covering topics like prenatal care, family planning, and reproductive health. This was a gynecological examination room. A gynecological examination room in my husband's garage workshop, equipped with thousands of dollars worth of medical equipment, maintained to what appeared to be clinical standards, and completely unknown to me until this moment. I opened one of the supply cabinets and found it stocked with everything a women's health clinic would need: examination gloves, disposable gowns, sterile instruments, pregnancy tests, contraceptives, prenatal vitamins, and educational materials in both English and Spanish. Everything was organized with the same meticulous attention to detail I'd seen in Harold's workshop, and everything appeared to be current and properly maintained. On a small desk in the corner, I found appointment books dating back more than 10 years. Harold had been seeing patients. No, that wasn't right. Harold wasn't a doctor, but someone had been seeing patients in this room, and Harold had been keeping the records. I opened the most recent appointment book and found entries up until just 2 weeks before Harold's death. March 5th, 2 p.m. Maria Santos, 24 weeks prenatal checkup. Blood pressure normal, weight gain appropriate. Discussed nutrition and exercise. Next appointment, March 19th. March 7th, 10 a.m. Jennifer Martinez, annual exam. Results normal. Discussed family planning options. Provided contraceptive supplies. March 9th, 4 p.m. Susan Kim, 16 years old. Accompanied by mother. First exam. Educational consultation regarding reproductive health. Follow-up in 6 months. Page after page of appointments. All scheduled outside normal business hours. Evenings, weekends, early mornings before most people would be awake. And all with women whose names I recognized from Harold Sterling files. Women from families he'd been quietly helping for years. But who had been providing the medical care? Harold had no medical training beyond basic first aid. I was a nurse, but I'd been retired for 8 years, and I certainly hadn't been seeing patients in our garage. And even if I had been, I wouldn't have been qualified to perform gynecological examinations. I found part of the answer in another filing cabinet, this one containing medical licenses, certifications, and correspondence. Dr. Elena Vasquez, MD, Obstetrics and Gynecology, licensed in Iowa, board certified, and apparently operating a free clinic for underserved women out of my husband's garage workshop. The correspondence between Harold and Dr. Vasquez went back 12 years, starting with a simple letter. Mr. Chen, thank you for your inquiry about establishing a clinic space for women who cannot afford regular gynecological care. Your offer to provide space and equipment is incredibly generous, and I would be honored to volunteer my services in partnership with your charitable foundation. As discussed, many women in rural Iowa have limited access to reproductive health care, particularly those without insurance or transportation to larger cities. A discreet, part-time clinic could serve women who might otherwise go without essential medical care. I understand your desire to maintain anonymity in your charitable work. I would be happy to handle all medical aspects while you manage the logistics and funding. Please let me know how you would like to proceed. Sincerely, Dr. Elena Vasquez. Harold had established a free women's health clinic. Using his sterling identity and resources, he'd created a safe, professional space where women who couldn't afford regular medical care could receive essential reproductive health services. And he'd been operating this clinic for over a decade without my knowledge. But how? How had Harold managed to have women coming and going from our garage for medical appointments without my noticing? How had he coordinated with Dr. Vasquez? How had he maintained medical equipment and supplies? How had he kept this enormous secret while living with me every single day? I found more of the answer in Dr. Vasquez's patient files. The clinic operated only when I was away from home. During my Tuesday evening book club meetings, my Wednesday afternoon volunteer shifts at the hospital auxiliary, my occasional weekend trips to visit my sister in California, and during the hours when I was running errands or attending other social activities. Harold had been using my schedule to create windows of opportunity for the clinic's operations. Dr. Vasquez would arrive after I left, see patients who entered and exited through the alley behind our garage, and be gone before I returned home. Harold had even installed a separate electrical meter for the clinic space, so our household utility bills wouldn't reflect the additional power usage. The level of planning and coordination required for this operation was staggering. Harold had essentially been living 3 lives simultaneously. Harold Chen, the retired postal worker and devoted husband, Harold Sterling, the anonymous philanthropist and woodworker, and Harold Chen, the co-founder and administrator of a secret medical clinic. But as I continued exploring the clinic space, I began to understand why Harold had considered this work important enough to justify such elaborate secrecy. In a folder marked Patient Outcomes, I found records that told stories I recognized from Harold's Sterling files, but from a completely different perspective. Jennifer Martinez hadn't just received a scholarship for nursing school. She'd also received reproductive health care during her college years that had allowed her to plan her family timing and focus on her education. The scholarship and the medical care had worked together to change the trajectory of her entire life. Maria Santos, the young woman who'd appeared in Harold's recent appointment book, was the daughter-in-law of Carlos and Rosa Santos, a family Harold had been helping through various financial challenges for several years. Maria's prenatal care at the clinic had identified and addressed complications that could have endangered both her and her baby. Because of the early intervention, she'd been able to carry her pregnancy to term and deliver a healthy child. Susan Kim was the daughter of immigrants who cleaned office buildings at night and spoke limited English. Her mother had brought her to the clinic because she had no idea how to access reproductive health care for her teenage daughter through traditional medical channels. Dr. Vasquez had provided not just medical care, but education and resources that helped both mother and daughter navigate the American healthcare system. Case after case, patient after patient, all representing women who might have gone without essential medical care if not for Harold's clinic. And in many instances, the medical care was just one component of Harold's comprehensive support for these families. He was providing scholarships for their children, help with utility bills, assistance with housing, and medical care, all coordinated to address the multiple challenges that poverty and limited resources created. Harold hadn't just been running a charity. He'd been operating a comprehensive family support system, addressing educational, financial, and medical needs simultaneously to give entire families the tools they needed to build better lives. But the scope of what I was discovering was overwhelming me. How had Harold acquired medical equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars? How had he learned enough about medical administration to properly maintain patient records and coordinate care? How had he managed the legal and regulatory requirements for operating even an informal clinic? I found those answers in yet another filing cabinet, one that contained Harold's correspondence with medical equipment suppliers, regulatory agencies, and other free clinics throughout Iowa. Harold had spent years researching and planning before establishing the clinic. He'd visited other volunteer medical operations, consulted with attorneys about liability and regulatory compliance, and even taken courses in medical administration at the community college. The equipment had been acquired gradually over several years, purchased through Harold's sterling identity using funds from his woodworking business and careful savings. Some items had been donated by retiring physicians or medical practices that were updating their equipment. Harold had even established relationships with pharmaceutical companies that provided free samples and supplies for low-income clinics. Everything had been done legally and properly, with all necessary permits and insurance coverage, but all under the sterling identity that kept Harold's involvement anonymous. Dr. Vasquez held all the medical licenses and assumed all the clinical responsibility, while Harold provided the space, equipment, administrative support, and funding. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery was Harold's patient impact analysis, a detailed study he'd conducted of the long-term outcomes for families who had received services through his various programs. The women who had received reproductive health care at the clinic were more likely to complete their education, less likely to experience unplanned pregnancies that might derail their career goals, and more likely to have healthy children when they did choose to start families. The combination of medical care, educational support, and financial assistance had created what Harold called generational change, interventions that didn't just help individuals, but that changed the trajectory of entire family lines for decades to come. Harold had documented specific examples. Jennifer Martinez was now working as a nurse practitioner, providing medical care to underserved communities, and planning to open her own clinic. Her younger sister, inspired by Jennifer's success, was currently in pre-med at the University of Iowa, with her tuition partially covered by a scholarship from Harold's foundation. Jennifer's parents had been able to buy their first home because they were no longer struggling with college expenses and medical bills. The Santos family had not only welcomed a healthy baby, but Carlos had been able to start his own landscaping business using equipment purchased with money the family had saved by not having to pay for Maria's prenatal care. Their older son was thriving in school with tutoring support Harold had arranged, and their daughter was planning to attend community college with scholarship assistance. Family after family, generation after generation, all experiencing positive changes that could be traced back to Harold's carefully orchestrated interventions. Harold had been conducting a real-time experiment in strategic philanthropy, and the results were remarkable. But as I stood in Harold's secret medical clinic, surrounded by evidence of his extraordinary life of service, I was struck by a terrible realization. If Harold had been doing all of this work, managing a charitable foundation, running a woodworking business, administering a medical clinic, and maintaining detailed records on dozens of families, when had he had time for me? When had he had time to be Harold Chen, my husband of 52 years? When had he found the energy to maintain our marriage, our home, our daily routines, when he was essentially working 3 jobs simultaneously? And more importantly, why had he felt the need to keep all of this secret from me? Why hadn't he trusted me with the knowledge of his incredible work? Why hadn't he asked for my help, my support, my partnership, in what was clearly the most meaningful work of his life? I thought about all the evenings Harold had spent in his garage while I watched television or read books in the house. All the weekends when he'd disappeared for hours to work on projects while I pursued my own hobbies. All the times he'd claimed to be tired, to need quiet time, to want to just tinker around in his workshop. He hadn't been tinkering. He'd been changing the world, one family at a time, one anonymous intervention at a time, one secret kindness at a time. And he'd been doing it all alone, carrying the weight and responsibility of dozens of families' well-being, while maintaining the facade of a simple retirement filled with birdhouses and lawn care. Why hadn't he told me? Why hadn't he shared this beautiful, meaningful work with the person who loved him most? Why had he chosen to live this incredible life of service in isolation, even from his own wife? I found a partial answer in Harold's personal journal, in an entry dated just 6 months after he'd started the clinic. October 15th. Dorothy asked me today why I spend so much time in the garage. She said she misses our evening conversations, our shared activities, the way we used to do everything together. I could see the hurt in her eyes, and it broke my heart. But how do I explain this work to her? How do I tell the woman I love that I've discovered something that feels more important than anything I've ever done, but that requires secrecy to be effective? How do I help her understand that this isn't about choosing other people over her, but about using the gift of our comfortable retirement to make a difference for people who don't have our advantages? Dorothy is the most generous, caring person I know. She spent her entire career taking care of people, healing them, comforting them in their most vulnerable moments. She would understand this work, and she would support it. But she would also want to be involved, and her involvement would compromise the anonymity that makes it possible. If people knew that Harold Chen, the mail carrier, was behind these interventions, it would change everything. They would feel obligated to thank me, to repay me, to treat me differently. The help would become personal rather than systematic. The focus would shift from the family's needs to my generosity. The work would become about me instead of about them. And there are legal and practical considerations too. If Dorothy knew about the clinic, she would be liable if anything went wrong. If she knew about the Sterling identity, she could be implicated if there were ever questions about tax compliance or regulatory issues. Her ignorance protects her, and it protects the work. But it's breaking my heart to see her feel shut out from this part of my life. She thinks I'm losing interest in our marriage, in our shared activities, in the quiet life we built together. She doesn't know that everything I'm doing is an extension of the values she taught me, the compassion she modeled during her nursing career, the commitment to service that has always been at the center of our relationship. I love Dorothy more than life itself, but I love this work too. And I can't figure out how to honor both loves without compromising either one. I sat down heavily in Dr. Vasquez's office chair, Harold's journal open in my lap, tears streaming down my face. My husband had been carrying this enormous burden of secrecy, not because he wanted to exclude me, but because he'd been trying to protect me and the work he loved. He'd chosen isolation over shared joy because he believed it was necessary for the greater good. But that choice had cost him something precious. It had cost him the ability to share his greatest accomplishment with the person who loved him most. It had cost him the comfort and support that comes from partnership in meaningful work. It had cost him the joy of celebration, the relief of shared responsibility, the satisfaction of acknowledged success. Harold had been a hero, but he'd been a lonely hero. And now he was gone, and I was only discovering the scope of his heroism after it was too late to tell him how proud I was, how amazed I was, how much I wished he'd trusted me enough to let me be part of it. But as I wiped my tears and looked around the clinic one more time, I realized that my discovery was far from complete. Because on Dr. Vasquez's desk, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. Basa. It was an appointment book for next week. Next week, after Harold had been dead for 18 months. The appointments were still being kept. The clinic was still operating. But if Harold was gone, who was maintaining this operation? Who was coordinating with Dr. Vasquez? Who was ensuring that these women continued to receive the care they needed? And more importantly, how many other people knew about Harold's secret work, while I, his wife of 52 years, had remained completely in the dark? I reached for the appointment book with trembling fingers, hardly believing what I was seeing. The entries were written in Harold's familiar handwriting, but the dates were impossible. March 15th, March 17th, March 19th, all scheduled for the weeks following Harold's death. How could Harold have written appointments for times he wouldn't be alive to keep? As I examined the handwriting more closely, I realized my mistake. The script was similar to Harold's, but not identical. Someone else had been maintaining Harold's appointment system, someone who had learned to mimic his organizational style and attention to detail, someone who had continued Harold's work seamlessly after his death. But who? I flipped through the appointment book, looking for clues. The entries continued through the present day and into the next several months. Dr. Vasquez was still seeing patients every Tuesday evening and Saturday morning, exactly as she had been when Harold was alive. Someone was still coordinating the schedule, still managing the clinic operations, still ensuring that the women who depended on this service could continue receiving care. I found a partial answer in a manila folder labeled Transition Plans that had been tucked beneath the appointment book. Inside were detailed instructions written in Harold's handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before his death. Clinic Transition Protocol. In the event of my incapacitation or death, contact Dr. Vasquez immediately using emergency phone number. Inform her that Sterling Foundation operations must continue without interruption. Margaret Kowalski has agreed to serve as interim clinic coordinator. She has been briefed on all procedures and has access to all necessary accounts and systems. Jim Morrison will handle maintenance and security for clinic space. He has keys and knows the schedule. All financial obligations have been pre-funded through December 2025. Bank account information and access codes are in safety deposit box number 247 at First National Bank. Patient files and medical records remain confidential under Dr. Vasquez's supervision. Administrative records transfer to Margaret's oversight. Dorothy must not be informed of these arrangements unless she discovers the clinic independently. Her protection and plausible deniability remain paramount. Margaret Kowalski. My friend Margaret, who lived 3 houses down, who had been bringing me casseroles and checking on me regularly since Harold's death, who had gently encouraged me to deal with Harold's things when I was ready. Margaret had known about Harold's secret work all along. She had been part of it. And Jim Morrison, our neighbor, Harold's longtime friend who had helped him build the garage in the first place. Jim had been maintaining the clinic space, ensuring its security, facilitating its continued operation, while I remained oblivious in my own home. The people closest to me, the people I'd been relying on for support during my grief, had been keeping Harold's secrets even after his death. They had been protecting his work, continuing his mission, maintaining the facade that nothing unusual had ever been happening in my own backyard. I felt a complex mixture of emotions: betrayal, amazement, gratitude, and confusion all swirling together in my chest. How many people in our small community had known about Harold's double life? How many had been part of his network of service while I remained completely outside of it? I found more evidence in another folder labeled Network Communications. Harold had been corresponding with what appeared to be dozens of people throughout Cedar Falls and the surrounding area, all of whom had been involved in various aspects of his charitable work. Dr. Vasquez for the medical clinic, Margaret for administrative coordination, Jim for maintenance and security, but also teachers who identified students needing scholarship assistance, social workers who referred families to Harold's foundation, business owners who provided employment opportunities, and even clergy members who helped identify families in crisis. Harold had built an entire underground network of compassionate people working together to address poverty and need in our community. And he had done it so quietly, so carefully, that someone could live at the center of it. Married to its founder, sleeping next to its primary coordinator every night, without having any idea it existed. The scope of Harold's organization was breathtaking. He hadn't just been one man helping a few families. He had created a systematic approach to community welfare that involved dozens of volunteers and reached hundreds of people. Reading through his correspondence, I began to understand that Harold had essentially been operating a private, comprehensive social services agency out of our garage. There were teachers who received anonymous funding to purchase supplies for low-income students. There were business owners who received subsidies to hire workers from struggling families. There were landlords who received rent assistance payments for tenants facing temporary financial hardships. There were medical professionals who received equipment donations and supply funding to serve uninsured patients. Harold had identified every major source of suffering and challenge in our community and had systematically addressed each one through strategic partnerships and anonymous funding. Families who thought they were experiencing isolated acts of good fortune, scholarship opportunities, employment offers, medical assistance, housing help, had actually been receiving coordinated support designed to address their specific circumstances and long-term needs. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Harold's network was how he had maintained operational security while involving so many people. Each volunteer knew only their piece of the operation. Dr. Vasquez knew about the medical clinic, but not about the scholarship program. Teachers knew about educational assistance, but not about housing support. Business owners knew about employment subsidies, but not about medical care. Margaret appeared to be the only person other than Harold who had comprehensive knowledge of all the programs, which explained why Harold had designated her as his successor. But even Margaret's involvement had been carefully structured to protect both her and the operation from legal or financial liability. Looking through Margaret's correspondence with Harold, I could see that she had been skeptical initially about being involved in such extensive charitable work without proper organizational structure. Harold had convinced her by demonstrating the legal compliance and proper documentation of every aspect of the operation, and by emphasizing the importance of maintaining anonymity to preserve the dignity of the families being helped. But I also found evidence that Margaret had repeatedly encouraged Harold to include me in the operation. In a letter dated 2 years ago, she had written, "Harold, I understand your desire to protect Dorothy, but I think you're underestimating her. She was a nurse for 40 years. She understands confidentiality, discretion, and the importance of helping people without judgment. She would be an incredible asset to this work, and I think the secrecy is putting unnecessary strain on your marriage. Dorothy has mentioned to me several times that she feels like you're pulling away from her, spending too much time alone, keeping parts of your life private. She's not suspicious. She trusts you completely, but she's hurt. She thinks you're losing interest in your shared life together. You could bring her into this gradually, starting with just one program, letting her see how it works and why the anonymity is important. I think she would not only support the work, but could help you expand it and make it more effective." Harold's response had been firm but conflicted. "Margaret, I appreciate your concern about Dorothy, and I know you're right about her capabilities and her heart. But the decision to keep her uninvolved isn't about her abilities. It's about her protection, and the protection of the work. If Dorothy knew about the Sterling identity, she would become legally connected to all of our activities. If there were ever investigations into our tax compliance, our regulatory status, or our funding sources, she could be held liable. If someone was injured at the clinic, she could be sued. If a family receiving assistance decided to claim we had created inappropriate dependency, she could be named in lawsuits. Her ignorance protects her from all of those risks. As long as she knows nothing about the Sterling Foundation, she cannot be held responsible for any of its activities. But beyond the legal protections, there's also the operational security to consider. Dorothy is naturally social, naturally open, naturally inclined to want to share good news and celebrate successes. If she knew about our work, it would be nearly impossible for her to maintain the level of secrecy that makes it effective. She would want to tell people when their anonymous scholarships were actually coming from her husband. She would want to accept thanks and recognition for the family clinic. She would want to be acknowledged for the housing assistance and employment programs. And all of that acknowledgement would fundamentally change how the assistance is received and perceived. Wasamiha ifalachi, I love Dorothy more than anything in this world, but I love this work too. And I believe that keeping them separate is the only way to preserve both. Reading Harold's explanation of his motivations helped me understand his thinking. But it didn't diminish the hurt I felt at being systematically excluded from the most meaningful work of his life. Harold had made assumptions about my character, my discretion, my ability to understand the importance of anonymity, without ever giving me the chance to prove him wrong. But as I continued reading through the network communications, I began to discover that Harold's assessment of the risks had been more accurate than I wanted to admit. There had been close calls, moments when the anonymity of the operation had been threatened, situations where people had become curious about the source of their assistance and had started asking questions. In one case, a family receiving multiple forms of assistance had hired a private investigator to try to identify their benefactor so they could properly thank them. The investigator had gotten close enough to the truth that Harold had been forced to temporarily suspend all assistance to that family until the investigation was abandoned. In another case, a reporter for the Cedar Falls Gazette had noticed the pattern of anonymous charitable activities in our community and had started investigating what he suspected was an organized philanthropic effort. Harold had managed to redirect the reporter's attention to the legitimate, public charitable organizations in our area, but it had required careful coordination with multiple network members to ensure that no one accidentally revealed information that could lead back to the Sterling Foundation. The operational security challenges were real and constant. Harold had been living with the daily stress of protecting not just his own identity, but the identities and safety of dozens of volunteers and hundreds of assistance recipients. One careless comment, one moment of pride or excitement, one slip in maintaining the elaborate systems he had created, could have brought down the entire operation. Reading about these near misses helped me understand why Harold had been so committed to maintaining secrecy, even from me, but it also made me realize how much stress and responsibility he had been carrying alone. The mental and emotional burden of coordinating so much assistance while maintaining such strict security must have been enormous. No wonder Harold had sometimes seemed tired or distracted. No wonder he had needed quiet time in his garage. No wonder he had sometimes been less present during our conversations or social activities. He had essentially been working a full-time job managing charitable operations while pretending to be a simple retiree pursuing woodworking as a hobby. But the most painful discovery was yet to come. In a folder marked Personal Reflections, I found letters Harold had written but never sent. Letters addressed to me, written during the times when the secrecy had been most difficult for him to maintain. My dearest Dorothy, it's our 48th wedding anniversary today, and I'm sitting in the clinic after Dr. Vasquez finished seeing patients, thinking about how much I wish I could share this work with you. Today, we helped 3 women receive medical care that could change their lives. One young mother who discovered her pregnancy early enough to receive proper prenatal care. One teenager who learned about reproductive health from a caring professional instead of from unreliable sources. And one woman in her 40s who hadn't had a gynecological exam in 8 years and discovered a condition that could have become serious if left untreated. This work feels like an extension of everything you taught me about caring for people, about using whatever resources and skills you have to make a difference in others' lives. When I watch Dr. Vasquez provide compassionate professional care to women who couldn't otherwise afford it, I think about all the patients you helped during your nursing career, all the comfort you provided to people during their most vulnerable moments. You would love this work, Dorothy. You would understand immediately why it matters and why it needs to be done quietly. You would probably have ideas for making it more effective, more comprehensive, more responsive to the specific needs of the women we serve. But I can't tell you about it, and that breaks my heart. I can't share with you the thing that has become most meaningful to me outside of our marriage. I can't celebrate with you when we help someone achieve their dreams or overcome a challenge. I can't ask for your advice when I'm trying to figure out how to help a family with complex needs. Instead, I have to pretend that my time in the garage is just hobby work, just mindless tinkering with wood and tools. I have to act like building birdhouses is the extent of my retirement ambitions. I have to let you think that I'm losing interest in meaningful work, when actually I'm doing the most meaningful work of my life. Ha, nos, baya, a yon spa. Yon spa. Sometimes I wonder if I made the wrong choice. Sometimes I think I should have trusted you with this secret from the beginning, brought you into the work as a partner, let you help me build something even more effective than what I've managed to create alone. But then I remembered the legal risks, the operational security requirements, the dozens of people who depend on this work continuing without interruption. And I remember that protecting you from those risks is another way of loving you, even if it means accepting loneliness and secrecy as the price of that protection. I love you, Dorothy. I love you more than I can express in words, more than I've probably expressed in actions lately. I hope someday you'll understand that everything I've kept secret from you has been motivated by love. Love for you, love for the people we serve, love for the work itself. Your devoted husband, Harold. I was crying again, but these tears felt different. They weren't just tears of grief or confusion. They were tears of recognition, of finally understanding the man I had loved for over 50 years, of seeing clearly for the first time the depth of his compassion and the weight of his sacrifice. Harold hadn't excluded me from his work because he didn't trust me or value me. He had excluded me because he loved me too much to risk my safety and well-being for the sake of shared recognition or partnership. He had chosen to carry the burden of secrecy alone rather than expose me to the legal, financial, and emotional risks that came with being part of such extensive charitable operations. But he had also paid a terrible price for that choice. He had given up the joy of shared purpose, the comfort of partnership in meaningful work, the satisfaction of acknowledged accomplishment. He had chosen to be lonely in order to be loving, and that choice had cost him something precious during the final years of his life. As I sat in Harold's secret clinic, surrounded by evidence of his extraordinary compassion and his painful sacrifice, I realized that I was facing a choice of my own. Harold was gone, but his work was continuing. Margaret and the others were maintaining the operations, ensuring that the families who depended on assistance continued to receive it, preserving the systems Harold had built to address need and suffering in our community. But they were doing it without the founder, without the visionary who had created and sustained it all. They were trying to honor Harold's legacy while operating with incomplete knowledge of his long-term plans, his strategic thinking, his deep understanding of how all the pieces fit together. I could walk away. I could close the door on Harold's secrets, let Margaret and the others continue the work without me, maintain the ignorance that Harold had worked so hard to preserve. I could return to my simple life as Harold Chen's widow, living quietly in our little house, tending our garden, feeding the birds that still visited Harold's birdhouses. Or I could step into Harold's legacy. I could use my discovery of his secrets as an opportunity to finally become the partner he had never allowed me to be. I could bring my own skills, experience, and perspective to the work he had loved so much. I could help ensure that his vision continued to grow and thrive long after his death. But if I chose to become involved, I would also be choosing to accept the risks Harold had tried so hard to protect me from. I would be choosing to take on the stress and responsibility he had carried alone. I would be choosing to live with secrets, to maintain the careful balance between helping and hiding that had defined Harold's final years. And I would be choosing to potentially change the very nature of the work itself. My involvement would alter the dynamics that Harold had spent years carefully constructing. It might improve the operations, but it might also compromise them. It might honor Harold's memory, but it might also betray his specific wishes for my protection. As I looked around the clinic one final time before leaving, I noticed something I had missed before. Taped to the inside of one of the medical supply cabinets was a small piece of paper with a handwritten note. Dorothy, if you're reading this, it means you've discovered our secret despite all my efforts to keep you safe from it. I'm sorry for the deception, and I'm sorry for the loneliness my choices may have caused both of us. The decision about what to do next is yours alone. Trust your heart, but also trust your wisdom. This work is beautiful, but it's also dangerous. Choose carefully. All my love, Harold. Harold had known this moment might come. Even as he had worked to maintain my ignorance, he had prepared for the possibility that I would eventually discover his secrets. And in typical Harold fashion, he had tried to guide and protect me, even in circumstances he couldn't control. But the final decision was mine to make. And as I turned off the lights in Harold's secret clinic and walked back through his workshop toward our house, I realized that the most important conversation of my marriage was about to begin. a conversation with a husband who was no longer alive to participate, about work I was just beginning to understand, in a community that would never be the same regardless of what I chose to do next. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw images from Harold's secret world, the photograph wall, the medical equipment, Margaret's handwriting in appointment books, Harold's unsent letters confessing his loneliness. My mind raced through 52 years of marriage, re-examining every conversation, every evening Harold had spent in his garage, every time I'd felt him pulling away or seeming distracted. How many times had I asked Harold what he was working on, only to receive vague answers about just tinkering around? How many times had I offered to help with his projects, only to be gently redirected toward other activities? How many times had I felt a distance between us that I couldn't explain, a sense that Harold was carrying something heavy that he couldn't or wouldn't share? Now I knew. Harold had been carrying the weight of an entire community's welfare, the responsibility for dozens of families' well-being, the complex logistics of maintaining a secret network of charitable assistance. And he had been carrying it all alone, protecting me from both the knowledge and the burden through careful deception that must have exhausted him. By morning, I had made my decision. I couldn't walk away. I couldn't pretend I had never seen what I had seen, never learned what I had learned. Harold's work was too important, too beautiful, too necessary to let it continue without my involvement, and my marriage had been too precious to let Harold's sacrifice go unacknowledged. But I also knew that stepping into Harold's world would change everything. Once I became part of the network, once I took on responsibility for the Sterling Foundation's operations, there would be no going back to the simple life of a retired widow. I would be accepting the same risks Harold had tried to protect me from, the same stress he had carried, the same need for secrecy that had defined his final years. At 7 o'clock that morning, I called Margaret. "Dorothy, is everything all right?" Her voice was concerned but not surprised. Margaret was an early riser, but most people didn't call before 8, unless something was wrong. "Margaret, I need to talk to you. It's about Harold. It's about things I've discovered that I think you might know about." There was a long pause. When Margaret spoke again, her voice was careful, measured. "What kind of things, Dorothy?" "The kind of things that happen in garages when people think their wives are at book club meetings." Another pause. Longer this time. Then Margaret sighed deeply. "Oh, Dorothy. You found it, didn't you? You finally went into Harold's workshop." "I found it all, Margaret. The photos, the files, the clinic, the appointment books with your handwriting. I found Harold's letters to me that he never sent. I found his note telling me that if I discovered his secrets, the decision about what to do next would be mine." Margaret was quiet for so long that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, she said, "I'll be right over. Don't talk to anyone else about this until we've had a chance to discuss what it means." 20 minutes later, Margaret was sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where Harold and I had shared breakfast every morning for decades, the same table where I had sat just yesterday morning contemplating whether to finally enter his garage. She looked tired, older than her 75 years, and I realized that she had been carrying a burden too, the responsibility of maintaining Harold's legacy while protecting his secrets. "How long have you known?" I asked. "About the Sterling Foundation?" "About 8 years. Harold approached me when he realized he needed help managing the administrative side of the operation." "About the clinic?" "About 5 years, when Dr. Vasquez needed additional coordination support, and Harold was getting overwhelmed trying to handle everything himself." "And you never thought to tell me? In 8 years, it never occurred to you that Harold's wife might want to know that her husband was running a comprehensive social services operation out of their garage?" Margaret's expression was pained but resolute. "Dorothy, I begged Harold to tell you. I argued with him about it regularly. I told him repeatedly that excluding you was wrong, that you would understand the work and support it, that you could be an incredible asset to the operation. But he refused. He was terrified, Dorothy, not of you, but for you." Harold had consulted with lawyers about the liability issues involved in running the kind of operation he'd created. Even though everything was legal and properly documented, there were still risks. If someone was injured at the clinic, if a family decided to sue claiming inappropriate dependency, if there were ever questions about tax compliance or regulatory issues, anyone connected to the Sterling Foundation could potentially be held liable. Margaret reached across the table and took my hands in hers. Harold knew that if you were involved and something went wrong, you could lose everything: your house, your savings, your peace of mind. He knew that ignorance was your best protection. And he also knew that once you learned about the work, you wouldn't be able to stay uninvolved. You'd want to help, to contribute, to make it better. And that would make you vulnerable. I understood Harold's reasoning, but it still hurt. So instead, he chose to protect me by lying to me. He chose to carry this enormous responsibility alone, rather than trust me to understand the risks and make my own decisions about whether to accept them. Yes, Margaret said simply. That's exactly what he did. And it was eating him alive, Dorothy. The secrecy, the isolation, the inability to share the most meaningful work of his life with the person he loved most. It was destroying him emotionally, even as the work itself was giving him purpose and joy. Is that why he had the heart attack? The stress of maintaining all of this? Margaret shook her head. The doctors said it was genetic, that Harold had inherited a predisposition to heart disease from his father. But I think the stress didn't help. Harold was essentially working 3 full-time jobs, managing the foundation, coordinating with Dr. Vasquez on the clinic, and maintaining all the relationships and systems that made the assistance possible, plus trying to be a good husband to you while hiding this enormous part of his life. And now he's gone, but the work continues. It has to continue, Dorothy. Too many people depend on it. The families receiving assistance, the volunteers who've made it part of their own sense of purpose, the medical patients who have nowhere else to go for care. We can't just shut it down because Harold died. He made sure of that by creating systems that could function without him, at least temporarily. But not permanently. Margaret smiled grimly. No, not permanently. Harold was the visionary, the strategist, the person who understood how all the pieces fit together. I can manage the day-to-day operations, Jim can maintain the physical space, drive. Vasquez can continue providing medical care, but none of us has Harold's comprehensive understanding of the community's needs or his ability to identify new opportunities for assistance. Which is why Harold wrote that note, isn't it? He knew that if I ever discovered his work, I would be the logical person to step into his role. He hoped you would, Margaret admitted. Harold always said that if something happened to him, the Sterling Foundation would need someone with your combination of compassion, intelligence, and community knowledge to guide its future. But he also made it clear that the choice had to be entirely yours, with full understanding of what it would mean. I stood up from the table and walked to our kitchen window, looking out at Harold's garage. In the morning light, it looked so ordinary, so innocent. Nothing about its exterior suggested that it housed one of the most sophisticated charitable operations in rural Iowa. What would it mean, Margaret? If I decided to become involved, what exactly would I be taking on? Margaret joined me at the window. Everything, Dorothy. You'd be taking on everything. The financial oversight of the foundation, which currently manages about $200,000 annually in assistance. The coordination with Dr. Vasquez and the medical clinic, which serves about 40 women each year. The relationships with teachers, social workers, business owners, and other volunteers who identify families needing help. The strategic planning for new programs and expansion of existing services. She paused, then continued. But you'd also be taking on the secrecy, the constant vigilance required to maintain operational security, the stress of knowing that dozens of families' well-being depends on decisions you make. You'd be accepting legal liability, financial risk, and the emotional burden of carrying other people's problems. And you'd be giving up the peaceful retirement you've earned. Harold gave up that peaceful retirement years ago. Yes, he did. And it cost him something precious, the ability to share his accomplishments with you, to celebrate successes together, to have a true partner in the work that mattered most to him. If you choose to become involved, you'll be accepting those same sacrifices. I thought about Harold's unsent letters, about his expressions of loneliness and regret, about not being able to share his work with me. If I stepped into his role, I would finally understand what he had experienced, but I would also be accepting the isolation he had endured. What about the other volunteers? What about Dr. Vasquez? How would they feel about Harold's widow suddenly becoming involved in operations they'd been managing without me? Margaret smiled for the first time since arriving. Dorothy, they'd be relieved. Dr. Vasquez has been asking about you since Harold died, wondering when you might learn about the clinic and whether you'd want to become involved. She's always felt that having a nurse as part of the leadership team would strengthen the medical services we can provide. And the others? Most of them don't know you exist. Harold's compartmentalization protected their ignorance as much as yours. But the ones who do know, like Jim and me, have been hoping you'd discover the work eventually. We've been trying to maintain Harold's vision, but we don't have his instincts for community needs or his long-term strategic thinking. I turned away from the window and faced Margaret directly. If I say yes, if I decide to become involved, how do we begin? How does someone step into a role like Harold's when so much of what he did was based on personal relationships and institutional knowledge that died with him? Gradually, Margaret said, Harold created detailed documentation of everything. Every family we assist, every volunteer relationship, every system and process. You'd start by learning the operations, understanding the current commitments, meeting the key people. Then, as you became comfortable with the existing work, you could begin to contribute your own ideas and initiatives. And if I say no? If I decide that this is too much, too risky, too overwhelming? Margaret's expression grew serious. Then we'd continue as we have been, doing our best to honor Harold's legacy with incomplete knowledge and limited vision. Eventually, the operation would probably have to be scaled back or reorganized under different leadership. The work would continue in some form, but it wouldn't be Harold's work anymore. I understood the choice Margaret was presenting. I could preserve Harold's vision by stepping into his role, or I could allow that vision to evolve and potentially diminish under different leadership. But I couldn't remain uninvolved while expecting Harold's work to continue exactly as he had designed it. I need to see everything, I said finally. All the files, all the records, all the systems Harold created. I need to understand the complete scope of what he built before I can decide whether I'm capable of maintaining it. Margaret nodded. That's exactly what Harold hoped you'd say. He prepared for this possibility, Dorothy. There's a complete orientation package in his files. Everything you'd need to understand the Foundation's operations, meet the key volunteers, and begin taking on leadership responsibilities. He really did think of everything, didn't he? Harold was a planner. He understood that his work was bigger than himself, and he wanted to ensure it could survive his death. But he also understood that it couldn't survive without the right kind of leadership. Someone with the right combination of skills, values, and community connections. Someone like his wife. Someone exactly like his wife. Over the next 3 hours, Margaret and I went through Harold's orientation materials together. The scope of his documentation was remarkable. Detailed profiles of every family receiving assistance. Comprehensive records of all financial transactions. Organizational charts showing the relationships between different volunteers, strategic plans for expanding services, and even contingency protocols for various crisis scenarios. Harold had been operating with the professionalism and sophistication of a major nonprofit organization, but with the intimacy and personal attention of a family support network. Every file told a story not just of financial assistance, but of careful attention to individual circumstances, long-term planning for family stability, and strategic intervention designed to create lasting positive change. The Martinez family's file, for example, didn't just document Jennifer's scholarship assistance. It tracked her academic progress, her career development, her family's evolving financial situation, and opportunities for her younger siblings. Harold had been thinking generationally, planning interventions that would affect not just Jennifer, but her future children and her extended family network. The Santos family's file showed similar comprehensive attention. Harold had identified Carlos's entrepreneurial potential years before Carlos himself recognized it, had provided strategic assistance to help Carlos develop business skills, and had coordinated multiple forms of support to enable Carlos to start his landscaping company. The medical care for Maria during her pregnancy was just one component of a multi-year investment in the family's long-term success. As I read through family after family's records, I began to understand that Harold hadn't just been providing charity. He had been conducting a sophisticated experiment in strategic philanthropy, testing theories about how targeted assistance could create sustainable positive change in people's lives. And the results were remarkable. Nearly every family that had received Harold's assistance was demonstrably better off than they had been before his intervention. Children were graduating from college, adults were starting businesses, families were buying homes, people were accessing medical care and achieving stability that had previously seemed impossible. Harold had documented it all, tracked the outcomes, analyzed the patterns, and used that analysis to refine his approach and improve his effectiveness. He had been conducting research quality evaluation of his charitable work, generating data that could inform broader discussions about poverty relief and community development. "Margaret," I said as we finished reviewing the files, "this isn't just charitable work. This is a model for how communities could address poverty and inequality." Harold wasn't just helping individual families. He was developing a replicable system for creating social change. Margaret nodded. "That's exactly what Harold hoped you'd see." He always said that if the Sterling Foundation approach worked in Cedar Falls, it could work anywhere. But he also said that scaling it up would require someone with the vision to see beyond individual assistance to systemic change. Someone with my background in healthcare and community service. Someone with your background, your values, and your connection to this community. Harold always said that the Sterling Foundation's greatest limitation was that it was entirely dependent on his personal knowledge and relationships. With your involvement, it could become something more sustainable and more impactful. I looked around Harold's workshop, seeing it now not as a monument to secrets and deception, but as the headquarters of an operation that had quietly transformed dozens of lives. The photographs on the wall weren't just evidence of Harold's hidden activities. They were documentation of real human progress, of families achieving dreams that had once seemed impossible. "All right," I said finally. "I'm in. I don't know if I can do everything Harold did, but I want to try. I want to honor his legacy by continuing his work, and I want to build on what he created to make it even more effective." Margaret smiled, and for the first time since Harold's death, I saw genuine relief in her expression. "Harold would be so proud, Dorothy. This is exactly what he hoped would happen, even though he was too worried about protecting you to ask for it directly. When do we start? How about tomorrow?" Dr. Vasquez is scheduled to see patients on Tuesday evening. You could observe the clinic operations, meet her formally, and begin to understand how that part of the work functions. And then we begin the real work of stepping into Harold's legacy while building something new together. Something that honors what he created while expanding it in ways he never could have imagined. As Margaret gathered up Harold's files to take back to her house for safekeeping, I realized that this conversation had changed everything. I was no longer Harold Chen's widow, quietly grieving in her empty house. I was Dorothy Chen, the new director of operations for the most sophisticated charitable network in rural Iowa, about to begin the most challenging and meaningful work of my life. But I was also about to discover that stepping into Harold's world would mean confronting secrets even Harold hadn't known he was keeping. Part 6. Final. The greatest secret revealed. Part 6. Transformation, New World, Resolution. Tuesday evening arrived with the crisp promise of early November. I had spent the day reviewing Harold's files, with an intensity I hadn't felt since my nursing school days, preparing for my first direct involvement in the work that had defined the last 15 years of my husband's life. Margaret had walked me through the clinic protocols, the patient confidentiality procedures, and the careful choreography required to maintain operational security. At 5:30 p.m., I positioned myself in Harold's workshop, watching through the small back windows as Dr. Elena Vasquez's car pulled into the alley behind our garage. She was a small woman in her mid-50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to working in challenging circumstances. Margaret had told me that Dr. Vasquez had been volunteering her services for 12 years, never accepting payment, never seeking recognition, committed to the mission of providing quality healthcare to women who had nowhere else to turn. I opened the back door of the garage as Dr. Vasquez approached, and found myself face to face with someone who had been an integral part of my husband's secret life for over a decade. "Mrs. Chen," she said, extending her hand with a warm smile. "I cannot tell you how long I have hoped for this meeting. Harold spoke of you constantly, your nursing background, your compassion, your intelligence. He was so proud of you and so protective of you." "Dr. Vasquez, I'm still trying to understand everything Harold was involved in. This is all so overwhelming. Please, call me Elena." And yes, it is overwhelming. When Harold first approached me about establishing this clinic, I thought he was perhaps a little bit crazy. A retired mail carrier wanting to fund a comprehensive women's health program? But then I saw his files, his research, his understanding of the community's needs, and I realized I was meeting someone extraordinary. Elena moved efficiently around the clinic's space, checking supplies, reviewing the evening's appointments, preparing for her patients with the same professional routine she would follow in any medical facility. But as I watched her work, I began to understand that this wasn't just a volunteer commitment for her. This was a calling. "Elena, can I ask you something? Why did you agree to do this? You could have volunteered at established clinics, worked with recognized organizations, received proper acknowledgement for your service. Why choose to work in secret with someone you barely knew?" Elena paused in her preparations and looked at me thoughtfully. "Mrs. Chen, Dorothy, have you ever seen a young woman cry with relief when she learns that she can receive medical care without worrying about how to pay for it? Have you ever watched a mother finally get answers about health concerns she's been ignoring because she couldn't afford to see a doctor?" She gestured toward the examination table, the carefully organized supplies, the comfortable environment Harold had created. "In my regular practice, I see insured patients in a busy office where I have 15 minutes per appointment and little opportunity to provide comprehensive education or support. Here, I can spend an hour with each woman, can address not just immediate medical needs but long-term health planning, can provide care that's truly patient-centered rather than insurance-centered. But the secrecy, the complexity of maintaining this operation, the secrecy protects the dignity of the women we serve," Elena said firmly. "They're not charity cases here. They're patients receiving professional medical care in a respectful environment. They don't have to navigate complicated social services systems or prove their worthiness for assistance. They just have to show up and be cared for." At 6 o'clock, our first patient arrived. Maria Santos, the young woman I'd read about in Harold's files, whose prenatal care had identified complications that could have endangered her pregnancy. She was now holding a beautiful 6-month-old baby and had returned for her routine postpartum care. "Mrs. Chen?" Maria looked surprised to see me in the clinic. "I didn't know you were involved with Dr. Elena's work." "I'm just beginning to learn about it," I said honestly. "Harold kept this all very private." Maria's expression grew thoughtful. "Mr. Chen was an angel, you know. Not just because of the clinic, but because of everything he did for our family. The help with Carlos's business, the assistance when I was having problems during pregnancy, the way he always seemed to know exactly what we needed at exactly the right time." As Elena conducted Maria's examination, I observed the professional, compassionate care being provided in Harold's makeshift clinic. The quality was identical to what Maria would have received in any major medical facility. But the atmosphere was warmer, more personal, more focused on Maria as a whole person rather than a collection of symptoms. During the consultation, Elena and I learned that Maria had been accepted into a nursing program at the community college. The stability that Harold's various interventions had provided, Carlos's successful business, their improved housing situation, Maria's health during pregnancy, had given her the confidence and opportunity to pursue her own career goals. "I want to do what Dr. Elena does," Maria told us. "I want to help other women the way she helped me, but I also want to help families the way Mr. Chen helped ours, not just with medical care, but with all the things that make it possible for people to succeed." After Maria left, Elena turned to me with excitement in her eyes. "Dorothy, did you hear what she said? She wants to become a nurse, but she also wants to replicate Harold's comprehensive approach to family assistance. She's thinking about the work the way Harold thought about it, not just addressing immediate needs, but creating systems for long-term positive change." Harold would have been so proud to hear that, But more importantly, it suggests possibilities for the future of this work. What if we could train people like Maria, people who have benefited from Harold's assistance, to become providers of assistance themselves? What if we could create a network of community members who understand both the challenges families face and the interventions that can help address those challenges? As the evening continued, I met two more patients. Jennifer Martinez, the nurse practitioner whose education Harold had supported, and Susan Kim, the young woman who had received her first gynecological care at Harold's clinic. Both were now thriving professionally and personally. Both expressed deep gratitude for the care they'd received, and both, remarkably, expressed interest in finding ways to give back to the community. Dr. Elena, Jennifer said during her annual examination, "I've been thinking about starting a mobile health clinic to serve rural areas outside Cedar Falls. I have the medical training now, and I understand what it means to receive care in a setting that prioritizes dignity and respect. Would you be interested in helping me develop something like that?" Susan, Elena asked the younger woman, "You're studying social work now, correct? Have you thought about how you might want to use that training after graduation?" Susan nodded enthusiastically. "I want to work with families, but not in the traditional social services model. I want to work with people the way Mr. Chen worked with my family, identifying strengths and opportunities, providing strategic assistance, helping people achieve their goals rather than just managing their problems." As the clinic evening concluded and Elena prepared to leave, I found myself overwhelmed by what I had witnessed. This wasn't just medical care being provided to underserved women. This was a pipeline for developing community leaders, a system for creating advocates and service providers, a method for transforming assistance recipients into assistance providers. "Elena," I said as we cleaned and secured the clinic space, "I think Harold created something even more significant than he realized. He wasn't just helping individual families. He was developing a model for community-driven social change." Elena smiled. "I think you're right. And I think he knew it, even if he didn't always articulate it that way. Harold always talked about generational change, interventions that would affect not just immediate circumstances, but long-term family trajectories. But what I'm seeing now is even broader than that. It's cultural change, community change, the development of local leadership and local solutions to persistent problems." We walked together toward the garage door, but Elena paused before leaving. "Dorothy, there's something else you should know about Harold's work, something that might help you understand the full scope of what he accomplished." "What do you mean?" Elena looked thoughtful. "When Harold first approached me about the clinic, I was curious about his motivation. Most people who want to fund medical services have some personal connection to healthcare. A family member who struggled to access care, a personal experience with medical bills or insurance problems. But Harold didn't seem to have any of those typical motivations. So I asked him why women's health care specifically, why the focus on reproductive health and family planning, and his answer surprised me." "What did he say?" Elena smiled. "He said that after 43 years of delivering mail, he'd observed that the families who struggled most were often those where women didn't have access to health care that allowed them to plan their families, space their children, and maintain their own health while caring for others. He said that women's health was often the foundation that made everything else possible: education, employment, financial stability, family well-being." That sounds like Harold. But then he said something that made me realize he had thought about this much more deeply than I initially understood. He said that in his experience, when women in a community had access to comprehensive health care and family planning resources, entire communities became stronger. Children were healthier, families were more stable, women could contribute to local economic development, and the cycle of poverty was more likely to be broken. Elena paused at the door. "Dorothy, Harold wasn't just helping individual women. He was investing in community development through women's health. And the results prove he was right. Look at the families we've served. The women who received care here have gone on to complete their education, start businesses, become community leaders, and raise children who are also achieving remarkable things." After Elena left, I sat alone in Harold's workshop, surrounded by the evidence of his extraordinary vision and the reality of its successful implementation. But as I reflected on the evening's conversations, I began to understand that Harold's greatest secret wasn't the clinic, wasn't the Sterling Foundation, wasn't even the comprehensive network of assistants he'd created. Harold's greatest secret was that he had been conducting a real-time experiment in social change, testing theories about community development and poverty intervention that could transform how entire societies address inequality and need. And he had been doing it so quietly, so humbly, that even he might not have fully understood the significance of what he was accomplishing. I opened Harold's personal journal to the final entry written just days before his death. March 10th. Today marks 15 years since I started this work. 15 years of learning, experimenting, adjusting, trying to understand how strategic assistance can create lasting positive change in people's lives. When I began, I thought I was just helping individual families solve immediate problems. But I'm starting to see something bigger emerging. The people we've assisted aren't just achieving their goals. They're becoming advocates and helpers themselves. They're developing the skills and resources to address challenges in their own communities. They're creating networks of mutual support that extend far beyond anything I could organize or fund. Jennifer Martinez isn't just a nurse practitioner now. She's planning to establish her own clinic to serve rural communities. Carlos Santos isn't just running a successful landscaping business. He's hiring workers from struggling families and providing them with the same kind of strategic support he received. Maria Santos isn't just a healthy mother. She's studying to become a nurse and talking about ways to combine medical care with comprehensive family assistance. I think what we've created here in Cedar Falls could be replicated anywhere. Not the specific programs or the particular interventions, but the approach. The idea that strategic, coordinated assistance can help communities develop their own capacity to address poverty and inequality. But for that to happen, this work needs to outlive me. It needs to evolve beyond what I could accomplish alone. It needs leadership that can see the broader possibilities and has the vision to scale successful innovations. Dorothy would be perfect for this work. She has the healthcare background to understand the medical components, the community connections to expand the network, and the intelligence to see patterns and opportunities I might miss. But more than that, she has the heart for it, the deep compassion and commitment to service that has to be at the center of any meaningful social change effort. If something happens to me, if Dorothy discovers this work and chooses to become involved, I hope she'll see not just what I built, but what it could become. I hope she'll understand that the Sterling Foundation could be the beginning of something much larger, a model for community-driven social change that could transform how we think about poverty, assistance, and mutual support. The greatest secret isn't that I've been helping people in our community. The greatest secret is that our community has been teaching me how to help people everywhere. I closed Harold's journal and looked around his workshop one final time. Tomorrow I would begin the work of stepping fully into Harold's legacy, but I would also begin the work of expanding that legacy, of building on his innovations to create something even more impactful and sustainable. Over the following months, I worked with Margaret, Elena, and the other network members to formalize and expand the Sterling Foundation's operations. We established proper nonprofit status, created advisory boards that included both service providers and assistance recipients, and began documenting our approach in ways that could be shared with other communities. Jennifer Martinez did establish her mobile health clinic, serving 5 rural counties with comprehensive women's health care. Carlos Santos expanded his landscaping business into a worker-owned cooperative that provided employment and business training to dozens of families. Maria Santos completed her nursing degree and became Elena's partner in operating the clinic, bringing both professional medical skills and deep personal understanding of the families we served. But perhaps the most remarkable development was something none of us had anticipated. The families who had received assistance through Harold's network began organizing themselves into mutual support groups, sharing resources and knowledge, advocating for policy changes that would benefit low-income families, and creating their own interventions to address community needs. They had internalized Harold's approach, the idea that strategic assistance could create lasting change, and were applying it independently, expanding the impact of his work far beyond what any formal organization could accomplish. 2 years after discovering Harold's secrets, I was invited to present the Sterling Foundation model at a national conference on community development. Standing before an audience of social workers, policymakers, and nonprofit leaders, I found myself talking about my husband in ways I never could have imagined. Harold Chen spent his retirement years proving that ordinary people can create extraordinary change, I told the conference attendees. He demonstrated that strategic assistance, provided with respect and dignity, can help families achieve stability and success. But more importantly, he showed that when communities invest in their members' potential, those members become investors in their community's future. The Sterling Foundation approach isn't about charity or traditional social services. It's about recognizing that most people have the skills and motivation to solve their own problems. They just need strategic support at critical moments to access opportunities and overcome barriers. Harold's greatest secret wasn't that he was helping people. His greatest secret was that he was teaching people how to help each other, creating networks of mutual support that continue to grow and strengthen long after his individual interventions ended. After my presentation, I was approached by representatives from communities across the country who wanted to replicate Harold's model. Over the following year, we helped establish Sterling-inspired programs in 12 different cities, each one adapted to local needs and resources but based on Harold's core insights about strategic assistance and community capacity building. But the most meaningful moment came on a quiet Tuesday evening in our clinic, 3 years after I had first discovered Harold's secret world. I was working with Elena to prepare for the evening's patients when Jennifer Martinez arrived, not as a patient but as a colleague. "Dorothy, Elena," she said, "I have news. The mobile clinic program has been so successful that the state health department wants to fund expansion into 10 additional counties. But more than that, they want to use our model as the basis for a statewide initiative to improve healthcare access in rural communities. And," she continued with obvious excitement, "they want us to train other communities to establish their own comprehensive family support programs based on what Harold created here in Cedar Falls." Elena and I looked at each other with amazement. Harold's quiet experiment in strategic philanthropy was becoming a statewide movement. His innovations were being recognized and replicated at levels he never could have imagined. That evening, as I locked up the clinic and walked back through Harold's workshop toward our house, I paused at the photograph wall. All those images of families celebrating achievements, overcoming challenges, reaching goals that had once seemed impossible, they weren't just documentation of Harold's charitable work. They were evidence of his understanding that every person has potential, that every family has strengths, that every community has the capacity to address its own challenges if given the right kind of support. Harold's greatest secret hadn't been about hiding his charitable work from me. His greatest secret had been his profound faith in human potential, his understanding that strategic assistance could unlock that potential, and his vision that entire communities could be transformed if enough people had access to the resources and opportunities they needed to succeed. And now that secret was no longer secret. It was becoming a movement, a model, a new way of thinking about how communities can support their members and how individuals can contribute to collective well-being. Harold Chen, the quiet postal worker who spent his retirement building birdhouses and tinkering in his garage, had created a legacy that was changing how people think about poverty, assistance, and community development. His greatest secret was becoming humanity's greatest hope for building stronger, more supportive, more equitable communities. As I entered our house that evening, I felt Harold's presence more strongly than I had since his death. Not as a ghost or a memory, but as a continuing influence, a set of values and approaches that would outlive both of us and continue creating positive change for generations to come. Harold's greatest secret was that love, expressed through strategic action and sustained commitment, could transform the world one family, one community, one life at a time. And now that secret belonged to everyone who was ready to pick up the work and carry it forward. In my kitchen that night, I opened a notebook and began writing. My name is Dorothy Chen, and for 52 years I thought I knew everything there was to know about my husband Harold. I was wrong. Harold's greatest secret wasn't what he kept hidden from me. It was what he revealed to our entire community about the power of quiet service, strategic kindness, and unwavering faith in human potential. This is the story of how discovering that secret changed not just my understanding of my marriage, but my understanding of what one person can accomplish when they choose to put love into action. This is the story of how Harold's Garage became the birthplace of a movement that is still growing, still changing lives, still proving that the greatest secrets are the ones too beautiful to keep hidden forever. Outside my window, Harold's 23 birdhouses stood sentinel along our fence, each one still occupied, each one still sheltering families through the changing seasons. They weren't just Harold's hobby anymore. They were symbols of his understanding that providing safe, welcoming spaces for growth and renewal was the most important work anyone could do. Harold's greatest secret was now the foundation of our community's greatest hope. And tomorrow, I would continue the work of making sure that secret reached every person who needed to hear it, every family who could benefit from it, every community ready to transform itself through the power of strategic love in action. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.